some of the methods and so forth, what they've learned already been confirmed, I assume. So I'll go through some of those rather quickly. But mostly what I'm going to talk about in my 30 minutes is the results that we had from our work in Thailand, both biological surveys and the interviews, and then briefly to compare them with some additional analyses from Sri Lanka that show that there are some very stark differences between the two countries. So as I mentioned before, biodiversity loss, at least in my opinion, is one of the most important problems facing modern society. And there are many drivers of biodiversity loss, including invasive species, but really the number one most important reason for the loss of biodiversity is the destruction of forests, at least in terms of terrestrial biodiversity. So quite often, huge tracts of forest are completely cut down, but equally frequently, large forests are cut into smaller pieces. And we, in biodiversity, would refer to these little patches of forest as forest fragments. And so forest fragmentation is the division of a large continuous forest into small pieces that are separated from one another. And when it comes to forest fragments, size matters, because bigger is better. This is true for many reasons, but to give one example, you can't have a population of tiger in a tiny little forest, because you not only need to have space for the tiger, but you need to have space for their prey, for healthy populations of prey. So you need very large, continuous areas of land for certain species. And so cutting up forests in smaller chunks has negative consequences for many different kinds of living things. But fragments are better than nothing. Still, small pieces of forest are able to harbor species that could not survive in the heat of open grassland or savanna. Many species of butterflies, many species of bird can survive in little fragments, and therefore some forest is better than none. And in Thailand, this was part of the motivation for the original study. Why should we study forest monasteries? Our study there was focused in the northeastern part of the country, which is colloquially known as Isan. And this is a view from space using Google Earth of a typical forest temple in Thailand. You can see that the boundaries are very sharply defined. This is the entirety of the forest temple. There is no other forest around it. In Thailand, there are, to mind, we didn't find any forest temples that were part of a larger forest. In other words, the whole forest was the temple was the whole forest. That was all that was left. Here's another example of a forest temple in the northeastern part of Thailand. And as I mentioned before, this part of the country has been a rice cultivation area for many hundreds of years. It's one of the major rice growing regions in Southeast Asia. So the methods, which Masoon talked about a little bit already, involved first biological surveys, which in Thailand took place in 2009 and 10, in which we looked at birds and butterflies, both inside and outside temples. And then in Thailand, interviews with monks and villagers, which took place last year. And then in Sri Lanka, we did both the biological surveys and the interviews more or less at the same time last year. So in the Northeast, again, this is a view from space on Google Earth. This yellow line is the outline of Thailand, and this region here is the Northeast Isan region. You can tell by the brown color, there's just sort of a dearth of forest left. Each one of these little blue dots is one of the temples is a temple that we surveyed. So we surveyed over 50 temples in the northeast of Thailand. There is no official list, or we could find no official list of exactly how many temples there are in Thailand. But in the northeast alone, so just in this part of the country, we were able to locate at least 300 using Google Earth. So they're very common. There are many forest temples in this part. Because we had so many to choose from, we wanted to have a standard, a way for selecting the temples for means of purposes of statistics. And we selected temples that had to be located outside of protected forest because, in fact, we didn't find any temples inside of protected forest. And they had to be at least 1 kilometer away from other forests. And they had to have an area, a size of at least 10 hectares. And so there's another outline of the forest temple in space. So in order to survey birds, we used fixed point counts, that is a standard point, and the number of birds within a 50-meter radius were estimated using both visual identification and auditory identification based on their songs. So the number of sampling points depended on the size of the temple, and then on a transect for 1 kilometer away from the temple, an additional 10 sampling points were then chosen for birds, and butterflies were also surveyed in that way. And most of the forest temples in Thailand, not all of them, have a fence that marks the boundary, otherwise people would go in and cut down trees. And so we started the surveys from the fences outward. Butterflies were first captured with an insect net, and after they were captured, they were photographed and then released, so we didn't actually kill them. This is because the person doing the surveys, Celia, was an expert on birds but not on butterflies. So with those photographs, he was able to then go to their identification guides later and identify the butterfly species. So these are the yellow dots here are the point count areas for birds, and the red line is the transect for butterfly transects. And here, similarly, butterfly transects outside. Again, for birds, we tried to estimate the number within a 50-meter radius that we've seen and heard. There's butterfly sampling on the right. This is Syria, or Teng, who did most of the work with an assistant in all of the biological surveys in Thailand, and then he came here to Sri Lanka to help standardize the methods along with Masood. Here are some of based on his photographs, he made up a series of laminated identification guides to butterflies he saw in the temples, so that he was able to teach himself the species and quickly identify them after a few months of survey. So the trees inside. So, as Masood mentioned, in addition to the biological surveys, we interviewed monks and villagers. So in Thailand, we were able to interview 56 monks and 500 villagers. And the questionnaires, we had 2 separate questionnaires, one for the monks, one for the villagers. I forget the exact number of questions, but it was considerable. It was something between 30 and 50 questions. And so neither Masood nor I today will be presenting all of the data, but I'll be talking about some of the more interesting patterns that showed up. So I was able to bring funding to bring 2 American students over, including Christy Suteo, who's here to speak next, and Kimberly Kearns, both of whom went to Thailand, and also Christy came here to observe in Sri Lanka. All of the interviews were recorded, so we could go back, and especially most of the questions were multiple choice, A, B, C, D, but then there were a few questions that were open-ended, and then that would allow people to talk. And so then we had a record of what they said, so we can go back and afterwards roll it down. Lots of interviews. And then, as you already know, we replicated and repeated the whole study here in Sri Lanka. Both the biological surveys and the interviews. Deng and his assistant came over and in order to standardize the methods between the two areas. Okay, so our results from Thailand. So one of the questions we asked monks was how large are the temples? And the majority of temples were less than 200 hectares, so reasonably small. And of the 50, one or two were larger than 2,000 hectares. So there's a strong skew towards very small temples in Thailand. So these graphs are the total number of species that we found inside and outside. For birds, 140 inside and 70 outside. For butterflies, 172 inside and 57 outside. So this is what, 3 times more species inside temples than outside. And here, a little bit less than twice as many species of birds outside versus inside. So this graph, as you remember for birds, we did transects away from the temple of the balls. So within the temples, we had a number of point counts based on the area. And these dots here represent the number of bird species found for an individual temple within the temple. And then for each 100 meters away from the temple, each dot again represents, and they're stepped up here, the number of species that we found at a certain distance away from the temple. And you can see very clearly here that the lowest number of butterflies found within a temple is still higher than the highest number of butterflies found outside the temple. So you can see there's a very strong, this line here shows you a bit of a skew, although my sense is that it's a bit stronger than this. That's for the number of species. We look for the number of individuals, so counting all the butterflies there are, no matter what their species. Again, we have a similar pattern where there's more individuals inside versus outside. And if we combine those two in a diversity measure that's known as the Shannon-Weaver index, we find the same pattern, not surprisingly, which is that diversity is higher inside than outside of birds. Now, for butterflies, we use the total counts both from inside versus outside, so we don't have the same kind of graphs. But let me tell you how to interpret this. So again, on this axis, we have a number of species ranging from 0 to 80 here. This is the number of species that would be within a single temple. This is inside temples, and this is outside temples. The thick black line is the median number, or you can think of it as the average number for inside versus outside. So the average number, or median actually, inside versus outside is much different, and in fact there's no statistic on here, but it's quite significantly different. Many more species inside than outside. If we look at the abundance, the difference is even more stark. Many more, so this is log abundance, so this axis has been log transformed, just to make it easier to interpret. Many more individual butterflies inside a temple than outside, and again that's quite significant. And if we take our composite measure, which combines the number of species and the number of individuals, we find again the same pattern. Inside is better than outside. Now, the attitudes of the villagers, so originally we just did the biological surveys, and it was offhanded comments that villagers made, and that some monks made, that made me very curious as to what people's attitudes were towards the temples. And so this is, again, it's just a brief summary of the many questions we asked. So we asked people, how many temples are in their village. And for most people, there was just one. Although for some, there were up to 5 forest temples in their village. And almost every village in the entire region has at least one forest temple. We asked people what their job was, and so 61% are only farmers, and then an additional 17% are farmers plus something else. So more than 3/4 of all people are farmers. They get their living from working off the land. And the other jobs included housekeeper, laborer, shopkeeper. Only 2% employed other people. In the area around the temples, most of the land was rice paddies. Here, that's the bars in green. So this is within 1 kilometer of a temple, and this is beyond 1 kilometer. So they were either paddies or other crops or other plantations. So almost all of the land was some sort of agricultural use. And when we asked people how have the environments changed, so Kasun showed results from the same question, and it was quite, well, it's largely similar in that most of the things they thought had declined very, very significantly so. Almost everyone thought there were fewer medicinal plants than when they were younger, fewer fish, fewer animals, fewer forests. Although some of them thought that there might be more water reservoirs. Now in Thailand, this is perhaps a special case because in the early 1980s there were some very significant mudslides after some very big rainstorms, and the government went in and declared that all land on all hills greater than 30% slope was now owned by the government, and nobody could cut down any trees or develop it. And for the most part, that has remained. So people view land of a certain steepness, of a certain slope, as being their property, and they know that they're not supposed to cut it down. So from that perspective, they might view water reservoirs as something special. Although in this part of the country where we worked, there are very few hills, and therefore very few trees. When we ask people, do you use resources from the forest? The vast majority said yes, they did. They go into the forest within the temple and take things out. And what do they take out? Usually mushrooms, different kinds of plants. So bamboo, firewood, some take water, and then a few people also take animals and insects. In this part of town, people eat a lot of ant larvae. When we asked villagers' opinions on the importance of forests for providing ecosystem services, most people agreed that forest temples were very important in providing, for example, insects that pollinated their crops, or in producing rain that helped their crops, or being 100% thought that they were useful as a place to worship. Now, I'll summarize some of the data from the questionnaires for monks. We asked if the size of their temples had changed since they lived there, and about half said that their temples had actually gotten larger. About 14% they'd say the same, and some said that the temples had become smaller, which is sort of encouraging. If these temples are little arcs of biodiversity, the fact that they're getting larger is encouraging. We asked monks if they did anything to protect their temples from people coming in to take things out. And many of them said this is a number of temples, they patrol to keep people out, they water the plants, they replant trees, or they have community participation for protection. Much like the villagers, monks also agreed that the temples were very important for ecosystem services, such as crop pollination, regulating the temperature, cleaning the air, and so forth. So here's some examples in Thailand. Because people go into the temples, monks go to special measures to mark the boundaries of their temples, either by putting up these concrete markers or by erecting a fence around around the entire temple to keep people out. And basically, this is the area of Buddhism. It is forbidden to shoot birds in the temple. If you're caught, you'll get a fine of 2,000 baht. And if you know about it, you'll be fined 500 baht, and there's a phone number to call. If you find that the door is closed, please close it behind you. This will keep the forest animals from going outside and prevent the dogs from coming inside. Part of this presentation was put together by Lanka, and this actually says the flashlight battery discarded area. So there are many, within temples there are many mechanisms for conserving water, for using rainwater, for basically using natural resources to encourage wildlife. So for example, in many temples they feed the wildlife. They provide water, they have a mechanism for putting water in the canopy. They have bird boxes. More examples of providing water for wildlife and putting in sticks so that they can get in and out to drink it. This is outside the temple. So here's some examples of things that people collect in the temple. Quite often they collect mushrooms and herbs to use as medicines. Here is a pot of herbs, presumably to use as medicine, bark and leaves inside. More herbs. Okay. So, among the values of natural forests are very important for many reasons. They make oxygen, they absorb carbon dioxide. They retain water in the soil to provide a watershed. They have many decomposers, such as dung beetles. They're a habitat for wildlife. They're a habitat for pollinating insects. They're a source of food for humans, a source of medicine, and a source of recreational value. Now, in the northeastern part of Thailand, where there are very few forests left, all of these roles now seem to be taken over by forest temples. So all of these rather essential roles are fortuitously have been taken over by forest temples. And I think that in conservation, you so rarely get good news. When you read a paper in a journal about conservation biology, rarely is it something that makes you very happy. It's usually some horrible news about some awful tragedy that you didn't know that happened and the species is almost extinct. This is actually good news. Little did we know it, but in the northeast of Thailand, Buddhist temples are acting like little national parks and preserving what is left. And up until this point, people had known it, but it hasn't really been quantified or measured to the extent that we have done so in this study. Now, briefly, I want to compare some of the data with what we found in Sri Lanka. Now, I did these statistics a little bit differently in order to enable the comparison here. So here we're talking about butterfly abundance, the number of butterflies, no matter what species they are. And so what I did was for every temple, I took the number of butterflies inside the temple and the number outside, and I subtracted the number outside from inside. So if there's no difference between the outside and the inside, you'd expect that number to be about 0. So the number of the abundance in the temple is about the same as the outside. But if the number is greater than 0, that means that the temples have more individual butterflies than outside. So here, very clearly, in Sri Lanka, each one of these points, and again, many of them are crowded on top of each other, each point is the number of butterflies inside minus outside. They're all centered around 0 in Sri Lanka, and every single one is above 0 in Thailand. And this difference is very strong. And by doing this, the comparison in this way, each temple acts as its own control. Because you can imagine in this area there are different numbers than over in this area. So by subtracting the number inside and outside the same temple, it's a more valid comparison. So I did this kind of analysis multiple times. We looked at the abundance of birds, same result. The abundance of birds inside and outside temples in Sri Lanka is very similar, but in Thailand there are many more birds inside than outside. So if we're looking here at abundance only, these little cartoons showing that in Sri Lanka, you have similar abundance of birds and butterflies inside versus outside. Whereas in Thailand, forest temples have many more individual animals that are able to live outside of the temple. Now what if we look at the number of species instead? So this is often called species richness. The same kind of analysis, we took the number of species inside minus outside. In Sri Lanka, they're all around 0, but in Thailand, most of them are over 0. This is a very strong difference. Again, showing that in Thailand, there are many more kinds of butterflies inside temples than outside. And the same is true of birds. So this little cartoon shows that in terms of diversity, in Sri Lanka, the number of species is similar inside versus outside. Whereas in Thailand, the temples are like little oases of biodiversity. They're like little national parks. So to talk a little bit about the survey data and to compare between Sri Lanka and Thailand, this was a question we asked the monks. Do you allow local people to collect forest products inside the temple? In Sri Lanka, almost, I'd say, 60% said no. Whereas in Thailand, probably about 80% said yes, they do allow people to come in and collect inside the temple. Do you have a specific area in the temple where you allow people to collect things? This was similar. Usually, the monks do not have a specific area, but they allow people to go wherever they would like to collect within the month. What is it that you allow the villagers to collect? So here we have a very strong difference. The color red are the responses from Thailand, and the color blue are the responses from Sri Lanka. So when we ask monks, what do you allow villagers to collect? In Thailand, they allow them to collect plants to eat, plants for medicine, mushrooms, firewood, bamboo shoots. In Sri Lanka, very few monks would allow people to collect anything except for firewood, something that's already dead. Do local people, so that was, we asked the question, do you allow people to collect things? And then we asked the question, do people come in and take things from the temple grounds even if you don't want them to do so? And here, in Thailand, this is a percentage. 3/4 of all the temples said that people come in to kill any animals. And in Thailand and in Sri Lanka, this was very low. Also in Thailand, there were a fair number of monks who said people come in and cut down trees and also kill animals to sell, either as pets or for food. So we then asked monks, do you think that monks have a responsibility for forests and wildlife conservation in the country? In Thailand, 100% said yes. And in Sri Lanka, quite a few also said yes, but it wasn't 100%. So just to sort of sum up the major differences that we have highlighted so far is that forest temples in Sri Lanka seem to be small parts of a much larger forest, whereas in Thailand, the forest temples are like a little island in a sea of agriculture. In In Thailand, there is a cultural tradition of taking things from the forest, of hunting, of using guns, that doesn't seem to exist here in Sri Lanka. And so that cultural difference seems to be affecting the conservation value of temples to some extent. Although most of the things that are taken in Thailand are not animals and are in some sense a renewable resource. So in Thailand especially, forest temples are very important for conservation because there is very little forest remaining in that part of the country. And there is also a tradition of exploiting nature, which is to some extent quelled by people in the area surrounding the forest temples. Now, as I mentioned before, the first part of the study was funded by a grant from Harvard University. The second part, including all of the work here in Sri Lanka, was funded by a grant from my college, the City College of New York. The intellectual input was provided really by everybody here. And I didn't do any of the work. Kasood and Deng and others did all of the field work, and Ravi as well, from here in Sri Lanka. So we had a team from the USA, a team from Thailand, and then a team here in Sri Lanka that all really worked together to put this all together. And we still have a lot more, at least I still have a lot more data analyses to do